Back in 2024, one professor quietly laid out 3 shocking forecasts about the future of the United States. At the time, almost no one took them seriously, but now, 2 of those predictions appear to be unfolding in real life, and the third one is the one experts say could change global history. In early 2024, the global political atmosphere was already tense. Governments were dealing with economic uncertainty, geopolitical competition, and growing instability across several regions. Analysts in financial institutions, policy think tanks, and international organizations were debating whether the world was entering a new phase of global rivalry. It was during this period that a quiet discussion began circulating in certain academic and online circles. A professor had made 3 predictions about the future of the United States. At first, the statement did not attract much attention. Predictions about politics and international conflict appear regularly in public debate. Many of them never materialize. Most analysts treat such claims with caution. But what made this case unusual was not just the prediction itself, it was the structure of the forecast. The professor had outlined 3 specific developments that he believed could unfold in sequence. The first prediction suggested that Donald Trump would return to political power in the United States. The second predicted that the United States would move toward a confrontation with Iran. And the third prediction went even further. It suggested that in such a conflict, the United States could ultimately face defeat. For many observers, the third claim sounded almost impossible. For decades, the United States had been widely considered the most powerful military force in modern history. Its defense budget was larger than that of many other countries combined. It possessed advanced technology, global alliances, and military bases across multiple continents. Because of this, the idea that the United States could lose a major conflict seemed difficult to imagine. As a result, many people dismissed the prediction almost immediately. Some commentators described the forecast as speculation. Others believed it reflected a misunderstanding of how modern military power works. Several analysts argued that any direct confrontation between the United States and a regional power would likely end quickly because of the technological advantage held by the American military. At that time, very few people were seriously discussing the possibility that the prediction could become relevant, but the professor's argument was not focused only on military strength. Instead, it appeared to be based on a broader interpretation of history and geopolitical patterns. Throughout history, powerful states have sometimes faced unexpected challenges when conflicts move beyond traditional battlefields. Wars are rarely decided by weapons alone. Economic pressure, political divisions, regional alliances, and asymmetric strategies can all shape the outcome of conflicts. These factors often make modern wars far more complex than simple comparisons of military budgets or equipment. Some strategic analysts had already begun to observe that global power competition was entering a new phase. Major powers were increasingly competing not only through military forces, but also through economic influence, trade policy, technology development, and regional alliances. The international system was becoming more interconnected, but also more fragile. Supply chains stretched across continents. Energy markets reacted instantly to political developments. Financial markets could shift dramatically based on geopolitical signals. In this environment, even limited conflicts could have wide consequences. However, during the early months after the prediction appeared, most observers continued to focus on more immediate issues. Political debates inside the United States were intense. Elections dominated media coverage. Economic questions about inflation, interest rates, and growth were affecting businesses and investors around the world. Against this backdrop, the professor's 3 predictions remained largely in the background. But they were discussed occasionally in smaller circles of analysts and commentators, but they were not widely considered a serious forecast of future events. Then, something began to change. The first prediction suddenly returned to the center of discussion. Political developments inside the United States began to take an unexpected direction. Public opinion shifted in ways that many analysts had not predicted. Electoral dynamics started to move rapidly. For the first time, observers began revisiting the professor's original statement. If the first prediction was moving closer to reality, some analysts wondered whether the other forecasts deserved closer examination. But the second prediction was even more controversial. It suggested that tensions between the United States and Iran could escalate toward a direct confrontation. The relationship between the 2 countries had already been strained for decades. Sanctions, diplomatic disputes, and regional conflicts had created a long history of tension. Yet many policymakers believed that both sides would continue to avoid a full-scale conflict. A direct war would carry enormous risks. The Middle East remained one of the most important regions for global energy supply. Shipping routes through the Persian Gulf played a critical role in international trade. Any disruption in this area could affect energy prices, financial markets, and economic stability around the world. Because of these risks, most analysts believed that political leaders on all sides would try to prevent a direct confrontation. That was why the second prediction initially appeared unlikely. But as global tensions gradually increased, some observers began asking a new question. What if the professor had not been making a simple prediction? What if he had been studying a larger pattern in global politics? A pattern that was only now beginning to emerge? For business leaders, investors, and policymakers, the question was not just academic. If geopolitical tensions were entering a new phase, the economic consequences could be significant. Energy markets could shift rapidly. Supply chains could face new disruptions. Strategic industries could become part of broader geopolitical competition. These risks meant that even a controversial prediction could not be ignored entirely. And now, with the first forecast attracting renewed attention, analysts were starting to look more carefully at the second and third predictions. Because if the first development had already begun to unfold, the world needed to ask a difficult question. Was the professor simply making a bold guess? Or had he identified a chain of events that others had failed to see? For months, the professor's prediction remained mostly ignored. Political forecasts appear every year, and many of them disappear as quickly as they appear. Analysts, journalists, and investors usually focus on data, polling, and economic indicators rather than individual predictions. But during the political cycle that followed, something unusual began to happen. The first prediction started to look less impossible. Across the United States, the political environment was becoming increasingly polarized. Economic debates were dominating national conversations. Inflation concerns, interest rate pressures, and rising living costs were affecting households and businesses alike. For investors and business leaders, the uncertainty was difficult to ignore. Markets often react strongly to political direction. Changes in government policy can affect taxes, trade relationships, and regulatory environments. Because of this, the outcome of major elections always attracts attention from global financial institutions. During this period, analysts were closely watching the political landscape inside the United States. At first, many observers believed the political establishment would remain stable. Historically, American political institutions have shown a strong ability to absorb shocks and maintain continuity. But the atmosphere in the country suggested something different was happening. Public frustration was increasing in several areas. Economic pressures were reshaping political debates. Voters were becoming more skeptical of traditional institutions. These shifts were difficult to measure precisely, but they were visible in opinion surveys, public discussions, and campaign narratives. Political analysts began noticing that the electorate was more divided than it had been in decades, and in such an environment, unexpected outcomes sometimes become possible. The professor's first prediction had suggested that Donald Trump could return to political power. At the time the forecast was first mentioned, many commentators believed that scenario was unlikely. Political momentum, media narratives, and institutional expectations seemed to point in other directions. But political history often moves in cycles. Leaders who once appeared finished sometimes return to prominence when public sentiment changes. Economic pressures, cultural debates, and policy disagreements can reopen political opportunities that once seemed closed. Gradually, observers began to notice signs that the political landscape might not follow the expected path. Campaign dynamics were shifting. Public rallies were drawing attention. Media coverage was increasingly focused on voter dissatisfaction and the broader debate about America's political future. For global audiences, the situation created both curiosity and concern. The United States remains one of the most influential political and economic systems in the world. Decisions made in Washington can influence global trade policies, international alliances, financial markets, and security strategies. Because of this influence, the outcome of American elections often becomes a global story. International investors, multinational corporations, and policy planners all monitor U.S. political developments carefully. As the election cycle advanced, the possibility of an unexpected political comeback started to receive more serious discussion. Some analysts began revisiting earlier forecasts that had predicted such a scenario. Among them was the professor's statement. What had once seemed like a bold prediction was now being examined more carefully, not because it had been widely accepted, but because the political environment was evolving in ways that made earlier assumptions less certain. Markets began reflecting that uncertainty. Financial analysts often attempt to anticipate political outcomes because government policy can shape economic conditions. Trade agreements, sanctions, energy policy, and industrial regulation all depend heavily on political leadership. When uncertainty increases, markets tend to react. Investors begin adjusting their expectations. Businesses reconsider long-term plans. International partners watch closely to understand how future policy might shift. In this context, the professor's prediction was no longer dismissed as easily as before. If the first forecast was moving closer to reality, it raised a new question. Was it simply coincidence? Or had the professor identified underlying political trends that others had underestimated? Some analysts believed the prediction reflected a broader understanding of historical cycles. Periods of economic pressure and social division often produce political disruption. Established political systems sometimes experience sudden shifts when public trust declines. History offers many examples of such moments. Political comebacks that once seemed impossible have occurred in several countries when public frustration reached a critical point. The United States itself has experienced unexpected political reversals in the past. But even as the first prediction appeared to gain credibility, many observers remained cautious. One accurate forecast does not necessarily validate an entire theory. Political events are complex and influenced by many variables. Sometimes predictions align with reality purely by chance. Yet the professor's argument had never been limited to a single event. The prediction had been part of a sequence, and that sequence included a second forecast that carried much larger consequences. The professor had suggested that the United States could move toward a confrontation with Iran. For decades, relations between Washington and Tehran had been tense. Sanctions, diplomatic disputes, and regional rivalries had created a long history of confrontation. However, many policymakers believed that both countries would continue to avoid a direct war. The risks were simply too large. The Middle East remains one of the most strategically sensitive regions in the global economy. Energy infrastructure, shipping routes, and financial markets are deeply connected to stability in the region. Any major conflict could affect oil prices, trade routes, and investor confidence across the world. That was why most experts believed a direct confrontation would remain unlikely. But if the first prediction had already surprised many observers, analysts began wondering whether the second prediction deserved closer attention. Because if the professor had correctly identified the first shift in the global political landscape, the next development could carry consequences far beyond politics. It could reshape energy markets, alter global security calculations, and place the world economy in a period of sudden uncertainty. There are places in the world where political tension remains constant. Then, there are places where even a small spark can trigger consequences far beyond the region itself. The Middle East has long been one of those places. For decades, the region has stood at the center of global energy supply, strategic military positioning, and complex political rivalries. Major powers watch the region carefully, not only because of security concerns, but because events there can influence the entire global economy. At the heart of many of these tensions lies the relationship between the United States and Iran. Their rivalry did not begin recently. It stretches back more than 40 years, shaped by political disputes, sanctions, diplomatic breakdowns, and regional competition. Over time, the conflict evolved into what many analysts describe as a shadow confrontation. Both countries avoided direct war, but tensions played out through economic pressure, military presence, and regional alliances. For many years, policymakers believed this uneasy balance would continue. Direct conflict carried enormous risks for both sides. The Persian Gulf region is one of the most important energy corridors in the world. A significant portion of global oil shipments passes through the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow maritime route connecting the Gulf to international markets. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, roughly one-fifth of the world's petroleum liquids consumption passes through the Strait of Hormuz each day. Any disruption to this route could immediately affect global oil prices and international trade flows. Because of this reality, stability in the region has always been considered a global economic priority. Yet, tensions between Washington and Tehran have repeatedly pushed the region toward dangerous moments. Economic sanctions have been used as a major tool of pressure. The United States has imposed several rounds of sanctions targeting Iran's financial system, oil exports, and industrial sectors. These sanctions were intended to influence Iran's policies and limit its economic capacity. Iran, in turn, has developed strategies designed to resist such pressure. Instead of confronting American military strength directly, Iranian strategy is often focused on asymmetric approaches. This includes regional alliances, proxy forces, and unconventional warfare capabilities. Military analysts frequently point out that asymmetric strategies are designed to offset the advantages of stronger opponents. Rather than competing head-to-head in traditional battles, weaker states attempt to stretch conflicts over time, increase the cost of engagement, and complicate the strategic environment. This approach has appeared in several modern conflicts. In Iraq and Afghanistan, powerful military forces discovered that conventional superiority did not always guarantee quick victory. Complex local dynamics, political resistance, and prolonged conflict timelines created challenges that traditional military planning had not fully anticipated. These experiences changed how many strategists evaluate future wars. Modern conflict is no longer viewed simply as a contest of armies and weapons. It has become a multidimensional struggle involving economic pressure, cyber operations, information campaigns, and regional networks. This is where the professor's second prediction began to attract attention. He had suggested that tensions between the United States and Iran could intensify in ways that move beyond diplomatic disputes. At first, many observers rejected the idea. Both countries had strong incentives to avoid full-scale war. Military confrontation would carry enormous economic consequences. Global energy markets could react immediately. Financial systems could face sudden instability. However, geopolitical tensions do not always follow rational expectations. History has shown that conflicts sometimes emerge from gradual escalation rather than deliberate decisions. Small incidents accumulate, diplomatic channels weaken, regional rivalries intensify. Eventually, what once seemed unlikely becomes increasingly possible. Throughout recent years, several developments have kept the region under close observation. Military deployments have shifted, regional alliances have evolved, proxy conflicts have continued in various forms across the Middle East. Each event taken alone might appear limited, but together they form a pattern of strategic competition that analysts monitor carefully. For business leaders and investors, these developments are not simply geopolitical stories. They represent economic risk. Energy markets are particularly sensitive to instability in the Gulf region. Even rumors of potential disruption can cause price fluctuations in oil futures markets. Shipping routes, insurance costs, and logistics planning all depend heavily on regional stability. A major escalation could ripple through global supply chains within days. This is why multinational corporations, financial institutions, and government policy planners constantly track developments in the region. The professor's second prediction suggested that confrontation between the United States and Iran could become a central geopolitical challenge. Now, as tensions continued to rise in different forms, some analysts began revisiting that claim, not because war had already begun, but because the strategic environment appeared increasingly fragile. The world had entered a period where regional disputes could have global consequences. Energy markets, international trade, and geopolitical alliances were becoming tightly interconnected. This meant that even limited conflict could trigger economic effects far beyond the battlefield. For decades, the assumption had been that the balance of power would prevent a direct confrontation. But the professor's analysis had suggested something different. He believed that modern conflicts might follow a different path than many strategists expected. And if that interpretation was correct, then the most controversial part of his prediction still remained ahead. Because the third forecast was not about political shifts or rising tensions. It was about the outcome of a conflict that many people believed could never happen. The possibility that the world's most powerful military could enter a war and discover that power alone might not determine the result. For most of the modern era, military strength has been measured in visible numbers. The number of aircraft carriers, the size of defense budgets, the sophistication of fighter jets, missiles, and satellites. By nearly every traditional measure, the United States stands at the top of that list. According to data from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, the United States has consistently maintained the largest military budget in the world. In 2023, American defense spending reached more than $900 billion, accounting for a large share of global military expenditure. On paper, that level of military capability appears overwhelming. But modern strategists increasingly argue that war in the 21st century is no longer decided by traditional measurements alone. Instead, conflicts today unfold across multiple layers at the same time. Military operations remain important, but economic pressure, cyber warfare, supply chain disruption, and political influence now shape the battlefield as well. This shift has forced analysts to reconsider how victory is defined. In earlier centuries, wars often ended with clear military outcomes. Armies captured territory, governments signed peace agreements, borders were redrawn. Today, conflicts rarely follow that pattern. Instead, they often stretch across years or even decades, gradually draining economic resources and political stability. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan provided a powerful example of this reality. The United States entered both conflicts with overwhelming military advantages. Advanced technology, superior air power, and large-scale logistical capabilities allowed American forces to dominate traditional battlefields. Yet the long-term outcomes proved far more complicated. In Afghanistan, the conflict lasted nearly 20 years before the United States withdrew its forces in 2021. Despite extensive military operations, the political outcome remained contested. This experience reshaped strategic thinking in many policy institutions. Military strength alone did not guarantee a stable or decisive result. Instead, conflicts increasingly depended on local alliances, political legitimacy, and long-term economic sustainability. These lessons are now central to how analysts evaluate potential future conflicts. If tensions between the United States and Iran were ever to escalate into open war, the situation would likely be shaped by similar complexities. Iran does not possess the same level of conventional military power as the United States, but its strategic position within the Middle East gives it several advantages that traditional military comparisons often overlook. First, geography plays a powerful role. Iran sits near some of the most critical energy routes in the world. The Strait of Hormuz, located along Iran's southern coast, remains one of the most important maritime choke points for global oil transport. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, roughly 20% of global petroleum consumption passes through the Strait of Hormuz. Any disruption to this corridor could rapidly affect global energy markets. Even limited military activity in the region could increase shipping risks, insurance costs, and fuel prices. Second, Iran has developed strategies designed specifically for asymmetric conflict. Rather than relying on large conventional forces, its military planning focuses on regional alliances, proxy groups, and unconventional warfare capabilities. This approach allows Iran to influence events across multiple locations simultaneously. Instead of one large battlefield, conflict could emerge through many smaller fronts. Such a scenario would complicate traditional military planning. A war that spreads across several regions can become difficult to contain. Energy infrastructure, shipping routes, and regional security arrangements could all become part of the conflict environment. For the global economy, these risks carry enormous consequences. Energy prices influence nearly every sector of modern business. Transportation costs, manufacturing expenses, and supply chain logistics all depend heavily on fuel stability. If energy markets experience sudden disruption, businesses around the world feel the effects almost immediately. Financial markets respond quickly to geopolitical uncertainty as well. Investors tend to move capital towards safer assets during periods of instability. This can create volatility in stock markets, currency exchange rates, and commodity prices. For entrepreneurs and business leaders, such volatility creates planning challenges. Long-term investment decisions depend on stable economic conditions. Sudden geopolitical shifts can force companies to revise strategies, delay expansion plans, or redirect resources toward risk management. This broader economic dimension is one reason analysts take geopolitical predictions seriously, even when they appear controversial. The professor's third prediction was not simply about military defeat. It raised a deeper question about how modern conflicts might evolve. If wars increasingly involve economic disruption, political pressure, and extended timelines, then traditional definitions of victory become less clear. A country might maintain military superiority, yet still face strategic challenges if a conflict becomes prolonged, economically costly, and politically divisive. This is why many strategic analysts emphasize the concept of strategic endurance. Victory may depend less on initial military strength and more on which side can sustain pressure over time. History offers many examples where powerful states encountered unexpected resistance in prolonged conflicts. But the professor's argument suggested something even more complex. He believed that modern geopolitical competition was entering a phase where economic systems, energy markets, and international alliances could become decisive factors. If that interpretation proves correct, then the outcome of future conflicts may depend not only on armies and weapons, but on which societies can adapt fastest to a rapidly changing strategic environment. For business leaders, investors, and policymakers, that possibility carries an important warning, because if global competition is shifting toward a new kind of conflict, the consequences will not be limited to battlefields. They will extend into financial markets, industrial supply chains, energy systems, and the foundations of the global economy itself.